Welcome to From Caracas. Today we'll be speaking with Philani Mthembu, Executive Director at the Institute of Global Dialogue from South Africa. With him, we're going to be speaking a little bit about Africa Day, about solidarity in COVID-19 times, and how Africa is facing the pandemic. Welcome, and thank you for being with us here From Caracas.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Philani, how can we understand today the world in this way that the COVID-19 pandemic has put us in?
It's a difficult time because it's the exact time that that we would expect a global response. That we would expect, I think, more solidarity, more multilateralism in the world. But unfortunately, the pandemic finds us at a time of growing unilateralism. It finds us at a time where our multilateral institutions are not actually performing the tasks that they were set out. These multilateral institutions who have actually been moving against these institutions and actually moving almost even to dismantle and completely reshape these institutions. So it should be a time where the world can actually put aside all of its political, ideological, and whatever differences are there, and focus on a common threat, which is this unseen enemy, as it's been called, COVID-19. But unfortunately, we have not always seen the political maturity to be able to...
We've seen that the main countries putting out that solidarity, that friendship hand has been China sending medical aid to countries that must need it. And also we are seeing Cuba sending doctors to help in the fight of COVID-19. We've seen how Cuba has sent doctors to Africa, to South Africa, to Angola, to Cape Verde. We've seen that solidarity also coming and that call for multilateralism, to forget about wars, to forget about confrontations in this time. Why there are some parts that persist in confrontation, that persist in not taking into account multilateralism?
Well, I think unfortunately what's happened is that is that what we were seeing already before this global pandemic, some of that is actually being accelerated by this pandemic. So already before the pandemic, we were seeing narrow nationalism in certain countries, an economic nationalism essentially. Moving against, multilateral institutions. You look at the crisis within the World Trade Organization, you look at the current crisis within the World Health Organization, the biggest country in the world, moving, essentially isolating itself at the worst of times, and threatening to pull out, of the World Health Organization. So unfortunately, some of those trends have simply been accelerated, by the pandemic. But we have seen, as you mentioned, we have seen also countries from the global south showing solidarity. We saw it initially when China, when the pandemic broke out in China. And already then, countries from the global south were, despite having resource constraints, were sending the little support that they could actually send to China. And once China was able to deal with the initial outbreak in Wuhan, they then turned their attention to the rest of the world and also said, you know, you were assisting us when we were going through the initial stages, and we also want to play a role. So we've seen a growing amount of not only South-South cooperation, but also South to North cooperation. You know, there's also here in South Africa, Cuban doctors have gone through their 14-day quarantine period, and they are now actively working within society, you know, to help contain this crisis. And I think, you know, this is the positive side of this pandemic, because even countries that have very limited material resources, and, you know, countries that are even facing sanctions and you know, from the United States and some other countries, are still finding it within themselves to actually rise beyond the politics and say that we believe in the principles of solidarity, and we think that this is the time when we should actually demonstrate this solidarity. And we just hope that, you know, these examples will continue to grow, both within societies, but also across societies. It's a difficult geopolitical time, but I think by demonstrating what solidarity actually means, is that countries from the South show that, you know, this is not just words, but that solidarity must be actually accompanied by action.
Is this the time for that global south, that south that has been tried to shut, that global south that have been to be blamed or to be cataloged as where bad things happen? The one that today, in the face of this pandemic, is actually bringing the good out of it?
Well, I think it is bringing the good, but I also think it demonstrates quite practically that even the ideas of, you know, so this negative perception around the global South, it shouldn't be there. I think what this crisis demonstrates is that it doesn't matter how big or how small or how strong or how weak, you know, you are in the global system. We can each learn something from each other. I mean, you look at how countries have dealt with the initial stages of the crisis, and to a certain extent, you are seeing certain countries from the South with less resources actually responding better to the crisis than some countries with greater resources. And I think that's something also there is, which is, you know, the worst pandemic in 100 years. But if you look, for instance, in Africa, a lot of these countries have been dealing with pandemics, have been dealing with epidemics, both at a regional level, but they've also been cooperating consistently, you know, with, I mean, you mentioned the Cuban doctor's example, but the Cubans were also there in dealing with Ebola. Recently, China was also there in dealing with Ebola, you know, recently. Of course, there were other actors also involved, but I think it shows that even with the limited resources that African countries have, they do have this experience of dealing with the threat presented by epidemics and pandemics. And a good example is here in South Africa. We've been dealing with HIV and AIDS for many years. And one thing that has done is that it's actually created a state infrastructure within South Africa that's enabled the country to actually deploy the same infrastructure towards fighting against COVID-19. But that could only be there because the country for many years has been dealing with, with HIV and AIDS, and has built up an infrastructure for nurses, for contact tracing, and all of that. And it's simply now using that and adapting it to a different crisis.
We've seen that in the recent times, in the midst of this pandemic, that the media is calling that they're very concerned about how Africa will be dealing with the pandemic, that Africa's economies are going to be very hit by the pandemic. But we are seeing the numbers of infections in the world, in Africa, they are not even close to why so much concern about infections in Africa when we are seeing that, based on that experience that you have been also, Africa have been able to control to a certain point, of course, the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, in the beginning, I think what's been a little disturbing is to see almost an inevitability about some of the reporting that's come, you know, declaring that Africa will be, you know, the next epicenter and so on and so forth. And I'm not sure whether we can simply accept that that logic as though you know, there is an inevitability about it. Of course, Africa will be affected, you know, by it, but it's not inevitable that we will become, you know, like what happened in Italy, in Spain, and what's happening in a number of states within the United States, where the health services are completely overwhelmed. And I think we have to acknowledge that African countries also, a lot of them, even before, you know, when they just had very few cases, a lot of them did implement measures to close travel. You know, they implemented various lockdowns. I mean, with obviously the challenges that you will encounter in some countries where there's inequality, where there aren't, you know, good living conditions and so forth. But even with those restrictions, a number of countries acted relatively quickly. They didn't wait until the hospitals were overwhelmed before implementing various types of lockdowns. And that was also, you know, the case here in South Africa. I mean, it's being said that South Africa's lockdown is one of the most the strictest, you know, in the world. And of course, some people have been against that and so forth, but it is saving lives, and the results are there. So the biggest challenge for me, if the health crisis presented by COVID-19, even if it doesn't overwhelm Africa's health systems, the biggest challenge for Africa may not be the health crisis presented, but the economic crisis that follows, and even more so, the ecological crisis that even follows the economic crisis. And I think it is there where Africa is more affected, rather than, you know, the initial stages of the actual health crisis.
So the world, instead of focusing in the numbers from the pandemic, must be focusing actually on how to help the African economy to keep on its feet and keep working, even if after the pandemic ends.
Yeah, I think that's going to be quite important because, I mean, what we saw even before the pandemic is that for the last, 10 to 15 years, consistently, out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, we consistently saw that 6 or 7 of those economies were from Africa. And obviously, this pandemic is going to have and is having, a major impact on that, on our growth trajectories, on our development trajectories. And I think we should focus our engagement around that, around ensuring that the continent can continue addressing its socioeconomic challenges, building up its capacities, but also manufacturing more products within the borders, improving intra-Africa trade, which is still relatively low. So I think there's still a number of economic and political opportunities on the continent, and we should focus on ensuring, that the continent doesn't fall back too far as a result of this pandemic.
We've seen that some African governments have requested funds from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank uh, in order to help their economies keep working. You were given some ideas of of how should governments respond and the alternative to keep that African country's economy working and standing up.
Mm.
In which other ways is this alternative of asking the International Monetary Fund uh, money to keep the economies is a good way, or should which other alternative should they find?
Well, I think there's a very lively debate, taking place on the continent in terms of what other mechanisms, the world has. I think we find ourselves at where the funding landscape has completely changed. It's not completely changed, but it is changing. There are newer mechanisms, in place. So if you look at, the funds that have been made available to deal specifically with COVID-19. The African Union has, set up something like a solidarity fund where they involving whole of society, to actually contribute to this solidarity fund. So they're encouraging the business community, encouraging individuals, organizations to contribute, to the solidarity fund. We have a similar mechanism in South Africa where people are voluntarily contributing to the solidarity fund, where people are actually, people in opposition parties are also contributing to the solidarity fund, trade unions, people from higher education, people from the private sector. So that's one way about mobilizing domestic resources as much as possible. I think this is going to be important, not only in dealing with COVID-19, but also in dealing with a post-COVID-19, economic transition and a global landscape. Because yes, while, there's available funding from your IMF, but I think we always try to make sure that you have to scrutinize the conditions that the IMF would actually be putting in place. They are saying that this is an emergency to the new development bank, the BRICS new development bank. But there's also various funds on the African continent that are available. So I think we need to make sure that we don't put all our eggs in one basket, and understand that even if of the type of conditionalities that they might be imposing, and that you would of course be borrowing in dollars and not in the local currency. So there's a number of factors that need to be weighed, and to ensure that the IMF is not the only mechanism where people are going, because in recent years there's a whole range of new development banks that have actually come, whether it's from China, from India, even from South Africa. So there's a number of options, and I think countries need to, as much as possible, utilize all the options that are available in order to actually get, the best possible deal. But I think what's also going to be important is that African countries coordinate their efforts and are not just going individually. There's been a number of meetings where African countries are pushing, for least developed countries to be exempted from making repayments of existing loans from both the European creditors and other creditors. So there's a number of mechanisms at play, and I think we need to make sure that we fully exhaust all those options available.
About coordinating efforts, we are almost reaching the end of the show, but I want to ask you, because this 25th of May, the world is going to be celebrating Africa Day. How is the best way to help Africa, the best way to put the sight on Africa, on the richness they have culturally, naturally, spirituality? How can we keep in mind that Africa is not a continent where sicknesses come, where wars are taking place, where terrorists are going around? It's a continent rich, it's a continent that fights constantly for their sovereignty and to be heard and to be respected.
Yeah, no, I think you've absolutely nailed it, because it's exactly those issues that we need to focus on. We need to understand the continent's own narrative. So Africa must tell its own story through its own eyes. It must tell of its own struggles, its successes, and so forth. And I think that's what's going to be important. For too long, we've heard about Africa from non-Africans, from former colonial capitals, and these are the places which have been driving the image of Africa. So for too long, the image of Africa has been about death, disease, and destruction, and we need to undo that narrative. Because that's not what the continent is. I mean, this continent, it's going to double its population over the next few decades. It's of writing that history, of writing it through African lenses. So a decolonial, understanding of the continent. And if we can learn more about Africa, but from Africans and from an African narrative, I think the world will be much better, for it, because we will get a better understanding of the real opportunities and the challenges that the continent faces, and that Africans are not sitting back. They have their own agency. They are playing a role in the world, trying to shape matters. And we just need to support that process of African agency and Africans acting in their own best interests.
Thank you very much, Philani. That was Philani Mthembu, Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Thank you for being with us, hearing from Caracas, to understand a little bit Africa and to bring us closer to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming meeting us here from Caracas, and to understand and to build a better conscience of the world in this show. Until next time.